Hi, thank you very much, Owen. As Owen said, my name is Tom Grimes. I'm a cybersecurity specialist for Infoblox. Been in cybersecurity, network and cybersecurity for going on 25 years. And what we're going to talk about today is how DNS is being used as a threat vector for ransomware and malware, but also how you can use a protocol that everyone has on their network, DNS, to your benefit and turn DNS into the security MVP of your organization. So just a little bit about what we're going to do. First, talk a little bit about Infoblox. A lot of times people don't understand what Infoblox does. Infoblox has been a DNS, DHCP, and IP address management company for going on 20 years. This space we call DDI, so DNS, DHCP, and IP address management. A lot of times when you look at why Infoblox is playing in the security space is because of the DDI data that we have. So things like, DHCP lease information, because what happens is security events will come in and they'll typically be a security event log message and then tied to an IP address. And then it's left up to the security team or the networking team to try to map that IP address to a device or a user. So really, when we start talking about security, visibility is the first step on the security train. So because of our rich heritage, 20-year plus history around that DDI data, we have the ability to allow the security operations teams to map that over, whether it's a user ID, an Active Directory, or DHCP fingerprint information, like what kind of device is that, or host names with a DNS infrastructure. So again, that data, SANS calls that gold mine for security forensics. But when you also look at it, because the nature of the protocol of DNS is a query and a response, we are physically in line in that IP communication setup. So DNS can be used by malware and attackers inside of the cyber kill chain, whether it's reconnaissance, exploitation, command and control. But you as an organization can use that to your advantage, and we can start to knock these attacks off throughout this cyber kill chain just by being in line in that DNS stream. SANS has said for several years now that DNS is one of the top threat vectors because most organizations allow computers need DNS to communicate, so they allow DNS out of their organization. And a lot of times when I deal with organizations, they say, oh no, we've locked down DNS from our DNS server out. But the reality is every single client has a way to issue a DNS query, and then it goes all the way out to the organization. So DNS as a protocol is open, even if you only lock it down to your DNS server. And this is what SANS was saying, hey, DNS is a top threat vector for exfiltrating data. But now ransomware and malware are taking advantage of that DNS stream to do secondary payload deployments with DNS. We've actually seen some malware using DNS specifically around command and control. So I'd say the last 5 years, this DNS threat vector is very, very widely used both in ransomware and malware. So let's go over some examples of some real life malware that's using DNS as a threat vector. So first we have to talk about what is the problem we're trying to solve. And, people and companies have invested a lot of money, time, and resource to protect those ports that are open to your organization, whether it's a web, port 80, port 443, or email, port 25. And companies have invested in next generation firewalls, security, email security gateways to really kind of look inside of that stream and do deep packet inspection. But a lot of times they do not do that same deep packet inspection to DNS. So when a hacker looks at the organization, they look at this, hey, I've got this way in and out of the organization to go around the security stack. And how they do that is with a way of doing that, which is called a DNS tunnel. So how is a DNS tunnel used to deploy ransomware and malware? So first, let's talk about what is a DNS tunnel. So you as a malware author or hacker or whatever, you can go out there and register any domain that you want for, you pick your favorite registration service, pay 99 cents, and now you own a domain that is under your control. So in this case, in this example, we'll call it hacker.com. So now if I'm over here on my end client, if I issue a fully qualified domain name in my browser and say, www.hacker.com, it first goes through your DNS server, it goes through your security firewall, and if you allow that, domain out, then it goes to the top level domains, the root, it'll go over to the .com, and then finally it gets sent over to the authoritative name server for that domain, which is under the control of the malware or hacker ransomware kind of family. So now we have a way, and then if I own that authoritative domain, I'm gonna reply to that. So now I have a two-way communication, one in your queries and one in my response. So now I have a two-way communication with your infrastructure. So if I take the subdomain piece of that query for my authoritative domain hacker.com, and I start to encrypt data and put that in there, so these will just look like just long subdomains, but now I have a way, and then on my hacker infrastructure, if I basically take that data and decrypt it, so I'm going to encrypt it here and decrypt it over here in the hacker infrastructure, now I have a way to get data in and out of the organization. So I get this a lot, are DNS tunnels real? There's a penetration tool, a commercial penetration toolkit called cobaltstrike. Interestingly enough, Recorded Future did a discussion around command and control servers out there for ransomware, and they said still cobaltstrike is used in 25% of those ransomware as a service kind of architecture. So it's out there, and you can go on their website and they'll actually talk about how we can deploy our beacon or our secondary payload and deploy our ransomware over DNS. So they can use HTTP, HTTPS, or now DNS. So again, this is a threat vector that we have to make sure is plugged up in our organizations. But DNS tunnels are not new. Interestingly enough, they were around since 2013 with a protocol called a program called Iodine. And its first use case was to get free internet service from hotels and airports that had captive portals. So you would use their existing DNS server. So instead of going over HTTP and having to go to the captive portal, I basically use this DNS tunnel, and now I can get free internet access at hotels and airports or wherever they had a captive portal. You can go to GitHub and just do a search for DNS tunnel. I did this last month, and there's over 210 different code repositories out there. So, you can find this. It's very prevalent as far as a threat vector. Another way that hackers are using DNS to basically confuse and to misuse the concept of getting stuff out to the user is something called a lookalike domain. And this is where someone impersonates a real domain. So for example, we're at Infoblox, that's a capital I, Infoblox. If I used a lowercase l, it would confuse the user, and it's two different domains, right? Ours starts with an I, theirs starts with an L, two separate domains, but when you show it on a typewritten a Word document or a web form, it would look the same. And that's simple letter replacements. But now it's actually getting a lot harder to recognize these lookalike domains because of the international domain name. So it allows you to register your domains using Cyrillic alphabet or different types of non-English alphabet. And this is an example here. So we have this website here on the left, www.ca.com. If I click on it, the actual URL, it's using the Cyrillic alphabet, transforms itself to this. So these are two exactly same domains. One looks like ca.com, but it if you put it into your Google or Chrome browser, this is the actual domain you'd be going to. So this allows me as the hacker to create some very crafty domains that look exactly like what you're teaching your user to hover over and look at. I thought this was very interesting if you think about it in terms of, there was a research done a couple of years ago where they said, okay, we looked at all the 20 of the top US retailers that are out there. And in the top 20 US retailers, they created roughly around 20,000 domains for those companies. But there were over 100,000 domains that were what, quote unquote, lookalike domains, so that they were registered to spoof the user to think they were a major retailer. So there's some other tools that are out there. This is one that was just released back in August, a piece of malware called Vermilion Strike. Again, using that cobaltstrike, but now porting it over to Linux to bypass AV detection. So again, it's using it's using DNS tunneling to get that data in and out of the organization to deploy ransomware in this case. There was also some well-known actors out there. This is the APT, Russian APT Group 29. This is the same group that was responsible for the Sunburst SolarWinds attack, but they were targeting pharmaceutical companies that were doing COVID-19 research. The interesting thing about these guys, they even went one step further. They created their own DNS tunneling protocol. So they were not using any shelfware DNS tunneling protocols. They created their own, and they were using a non-standard dictionary. So again, they're trying to really go low and slow and avoid detection. And speaking of that, the ransomware group TrickBot basically have a module that they can deploy on domain controllers that does command and control over DNS. And I was like, okay, why are they doing, this was only deployed in some of their high value targets. And it's because, domain controllers, if they were talking to a foreign domain, it might throw up a red flag. Like, do you want your domain controller talking to hacker.com? But if it's communicating DNS over that probably will not, because domain controllers could also be your Active Directory or your DNS infrastructure. So your domain controller is talking DNS. I always say when you're looking at this data, it's not trying to find a needle in a haystack. It's trying to find the 100 bad needles in a stack of 30,000 good needles. And that's, again, what they're trying to do from a hacker malware point of view, hide in plain sight. And this is the one that scares the living daylights out of me because I use my credit card a lot out there. There is a piece of malware out there called AlinaPOS. It specifically targets point of sale servers, terminals. And if you have this malware on that terminal, when you as a user swipe your credit card through there, that terminal sends a one packet DNS request to a domain. And if you looked at that DNS request, it would look like it's just a very long subdomain. But if you take that subdomain and you put it into a cyber decoding tool like CyberChef, and you try to do a brute force decryption on that, when you find the right key, you'll notice that it has the host name of the device, the executable that was run on that device, your credit card data, and the expiration date. So all of that data now is sent out as a DNS request. So if you as an organization or the internet in general, a lot of places will cache DNS requests. So now if I think about this, my credit card information is stored in the internet out there for people to see. So, that was a little bit about, that DNS is a threat vector. So now how can you use DNS and turn it into a security tool? So the first thing you'll notice is, again, I was talking about this earlier. DNS as a protocol is a query and a response protocol. So there is automatically, we're in line in the setup of that security flow or that IP flow between a client and a server or a client and a workstation. So other tools as well use DNS. So when we talk to companies that have email tools and next generation firewalls, so a lot of things that happen have security with fully qualified domain names. So if you can also install that security software or security process onto your DNS infrastructure, you will now be able to expose it to anything that communicates over IP. A lot of times when we start talking about incorporating DNS security intelligence, it's called a protective DNS server. In turning your DNS server into a secure DNS server, it's the easiest implementation of security you'll ever have in an organization. I actually was working with a company with over 200,000 endpoints. And just by basically turning the switch on and putting threat intelligence into your DNS infrastructure, you can do this overnight. So what security product could you instantly create a security posture and increase security posture for your organization overnight without having to do tuning and false positives and all that kind of good stuff? And this is where, you know, if you look at like the NSA and CISA from our federal government point of view, they're saying the easiest thing to do to plug this a threat vector is to secure your DNS infrastructure first. You want to make sure that you're running a protected DNS server. And how we do that is we have threat intelligence that we just basically put into our DNS server. And there's three ways to do this, right? There's signatures. So if you're, you know, we have signature-based protection like IDS, IPS kind of protection for that DNS stream itself for the protocol of DNS. There's also reputation. So things like, you know, bad domains. So hacker.com, if it's a known ransomware or malware site, we can block it. Infoblox is a company, we block between, you know, 4 and 10 million domains per day. And then also there's an ability to look at it from a behavior point of view. And that's, again, those DNS tunnels that I talked about. You know, the domain that they're using, that hacker.com, may be a newly registered domain with no security blocking on it. So you need to have an infrastructure that looks at your DNS request and says, hey, this is either good or bad, a DNS threat stream, right? So I want to make sure that this DNS query stream between this authoritative name server and this client is not trying to exfiltrate or infiltrate data. So when we think about the threat intelligence of it, I've always been a fan. And again, I've been in cybersecurity for over 25 years. And we've always said, hey, defense in depth is a good strategy, right? I mean, you know, when you secure your home, you're not just relying on the locks on your front door. You've got locks, you've got maybe a security camera, maybe there's a dog that you have that helps. So you have multiple layers of defense, even for your home network. When we think about this, this was a great example. We've talked about defense in depth, but this is a real good example we did with a customer that had Fortinet, they had Palo from a next generation firewall, they had a third-party threat feed from Farsight Security, and they're using us. And over the course of those 30 days, we found 10 as all 4 vendors. If you add up all the indicators of compromise or IOCs that they found, it totaled over 10 million, right? So that's a lot of security intelligence. But this was the interesting thing. In this POC with this customer, real life example, only 90 of those 10 million IOCs were caught by all 4 vendors. And if you look at this Venn diagram, there's a whole bunch of intelligence or IOCs that were caught by only one vendor. You know, so over 96% of the IOCs, so 10 million of those IOCs were only caught by one vendor. So if you only subscribe to, say, Palo as a threat intelligence, you're only getting 1/4 in this example of the threat intelligence that you could if you incorporated all of your devices into DNS to take advantage of that threat intelligence and then share it with the rest of the organization. Now, you know, there's no lack of security alerts in any organization. And a lot of times when I talk to customers, it will say, okay, yeah, the networking team has to get involved because the security team says, hey, we've got this IP address that is going to this malicious website and we got to take it off. I don't know what it is. And if they say, oh, well, all those queries look like they came from the DNS server or some device, and here's the IP address. So one of the things from an Infoblox point of view, we tie the two worlds together. And I was talking about this in the beginning. How do we tie that contextual DDI data? So when we send out these security alerts now, It's going to say, hey, this user tried to go to this bad site, and here's the IP address. But here's the host name that's on that box. Here's the client MAC address that's on that box that issued that query. Not of the DNS server. This is the actual client that issued that query. Here's the DHCP fingerprint associated with that. And if they are logged into Microsoft Active Directory, here's the user that's associated with that request. Now, again, we can forward this up to your SIM, and now your security teams will have access to this. So resolution and mean time to resolution and mean time to discovery goes way up. The other thing that when we work with customers is just having visibility into all of the queries that are going off to your organization to brand new domains. It's interesting, 70%, there's over 200,000 domains that are created every single day. And 70% of those are malicious. Palo Alto says 90% in some top level domains are malicious, right? So regardless if you go with 70 or 90, or even just take a conservative approach and say 50% of all bad new domains that are created are bad. You have to have some visibility into your organizations and how they touch and use new domains. Just with coronavirus, COVID, in the 2 months from when COVID started, there were over 10,000 domains created in 2 months, right? So not all of they're trying to take advantage of whatever the news du jour of the day is. And I want to try to trick your users into clicking on something like, hey, you know, click here for the latest information around this vaccine. And so whatever it is, they're trying to get your users to think that this is a legitimate domain, but it's brand new. As an example, this was something that happened to me personally. Someone sent it to my personal address and it says, hey, action required. This is a standard phishing. You know, this is what we train our users to kind of look at. But I thought this was kind of interesting. Hey, here's the, you know, they're trying to get me to download this case file. And I'm sure if I downloaded this, I would get some sort of ransomware or malware. But the interesting thing is this email was sent to me on August 2nd. The domain, and this is our threat intelligence that we can get with our system. I can see when a domain was created. And you can see that this email was sent to me on August 2nd. The domain was created on August 2nd. So this is like, you know, security 101, giving you visibility into these domains that particular users are using for, you know, whether it's phishing attacks or malware attacks. And then, you know, this is another use case of, you know, how you can use DNS to help you. You're going to run into a situation where someone's going to come to your desk and say, hey, there's this new IOC that's out there, or it just hit the news. Are we protected? Did anyone go out to this domain? So with our tool, you can actually, we have a threat research tool called Dossier. You can go in there and I can plug it in. But because we're tied into your existing DNS infrastructure, now I can not only give you all of the threat intelligence around this, like, hey, this is a bad site. Here's when it was created. Here's all the threat partners that say it's bad. It's currently being blocked. But in your organization, here is the last 30 days of DNS data. And here's all the people that went to it. So did this domain get queried? And the red boxes go, if it was queried a little, it's a dot. If it's queried a lot, it's a big block. And then I can then drill down into it from an impacted devices point of view. So now very quickly I can say, okay, here's a threat. Is it valid in my organization? And here are the devices. And these are the ones I might have to go, not only IP address, but their name. I might have to track them down and do a reimage for whatever reason. So using DNS, and don't take my word for it, Ann Neuberger basically did a pilot for the NSA around if we just put security on our DNS infrastructure, how much can we protect against malware attacks, right? And their research showed 92% of the malware attacks from a command and control perspective could be stopped just by using a protected DNS service. Cisco did a similar one and they came up with 90%. And again, if you want to even go conservative and say, hey, 50%, we are going to be able to, if you, just by doing this one thing, turning your DNS server into a secure DNS server, you'll be able to offload all of that traffic also, because again, we go into that first IP session setup between the client and the host. If we can knock it down ahead of time, your firewall, you don't have to rely on your firewall. You don't have to rely on your endpoint. We're going to take all of that noise out of the system earlier. It's interesting. I was talking to a colleague and they said, you know, if you just relied on, say, the alarm system for your house, and you've got the best alarm system in the world, but you're still, you want to lock the front doors, right? Because you don't want to rely on a burglar getting into your house. And a lot of times, if your ransomware protection or your malware protection is solely based on whether it's a next-gen firewall or a next-gen endpoint, you still want to see, hey, these are known bad guys. These are known bad things. I do not want them in my organization, and let's knock them down ahead of time. So, you know, another thing, I'm a big fan. I used to live in Missouri. I'm a show me kind of guy. But when you look at the ability to use DNS, I thought I would share some real life examples of some of my work with some existing clients. So the first one, and this just came out, Guardicore just released this a couple of weeks ago, that basically said, based on Microsoft, and again, a lot of times Microsoft has these protocols built into their operating system that they allow them to kind of auto-discover services or do auto-discovery around DNS. But what happens is, if you're a malicious actor, you could take advantage of the algorithm. In this case, it was an auto-discovery for configuration around O365. And there were certain domains that Microsoft would just try, and it would try your domain. And if that didn't work, it would keep going until it reached maybe a high-level domain called autodiscover.com. Well, what these researchers found is if you went out there and registered some of these special domains, you would now start to get some of these Microsoft queries, and they would contain user IDs and passwords, right? You know, as people tried to log on to O365. So if it was a Microsoft, if it's a legitimate site, it would work fine. But now I can start to pilfer that data as a hacker. Well, they came out and said, hey, to protect against this threat vector, all you need to do is block the auto-discover domains that Microsoft would use in their back-off algorithm. Okay, that's great. How many are there? I downloaded the file. It was 9,000 domains. So how are you as an organization going to put in a block for 9,000 domains? I mean, that's a big file that you want to upload. I mean, that's a 9,000 file for your firewall. It could, have performance impact issues. So this is where using it on the DNS server makes a big sense, right? And then not only that, but using some sort of API programming. So all of our infrastructure has an API so that you can do things like this. So we wrote a Python script very quickly for this customer that you could basically suck in these 9,000 domains, but we wanted to show how we can go that much quick, what's the potential down the road. So we wrote a file. I did a sample with 122,000 domains, and I was able to bring that onto my DNS server and in our security software, being able to block on those domains in less than a minute, right? So now I could create this global block list, share it across all this infrastructure, but now I can do this programmatically. The other thing that we talk about a lot is, visibility is that first stop on the train. So when I look at, from a DNS request point of view, how many DNS requests are your devices doing? And admittedly, when I have conversations with customers, they're like, I don't know. We actually, because we're now in line with all these DNS requests, now we can start to look at the DNS activity, and we'll report on that for you. So we had actually one customer that 90% of all their DNS requests from an organization point of view were coming from one device. So, hey, maybe you want to take a look at what that device is. In this case, you can see my device here. I typically, on a standard laptop, and I'm just a sales guy that does, typical, web and email kind of functions. But my device does between 25,000 and 32,000 DNS requests per day. Again, that's where I was like looking at, if you're trying to hide in plain sight, if I have a 100 packet DNS attack, I'm trying to find 100 bad needles and 32,000 good needles stacked, right? That's why it's tough. But this will tell you and help you and say, hey, like a typical laptop is doing 25 to 30. We've got this device doing, 5 times the average. Maybe we want to take a look at that device, not from a security point of view, but what is it? Is it a misconfigured device? What's it doing that it's issuing all those DNS requests? And then we also talked about it as far as, hey, which sites are your users going to that were just created? So we do have a threat intelligence stream that you can take a look at inside of our product and say, hey, are your users talking to domains that are less than 72 hours old, right? So that's just kind of a stick that we'll put on there, because a lot of times reputation data takes 24 to 48 hours to kind of populate. So you want to look at those domains that haven't been into that security intelligence population time window. So 72 hours is a good window to look at. Like this was an example from one of my customers. They had 868 domains that their users talked to in 30 days. And again, if you do some of the, just look at some of the domain names that are coming in, you don't even have to, in this case, block. We were just logging it just to have some security visibility onto what's going on. So from an Infoblox point of view, how can we protect this DNS and DNS from a zero trust architecture? So we protect DNS in essence 3 different ways, right? First one, on those DNS servers. So we have the ability to be your internal DNS infrastructure. We have a product called Advanced DNS Protection, or ADP. It's a real-time intrusion prevention capability that gets loaded right on your DNS servers. There's over about 1,000 rules that protect against DNS from a protocol point of view. So like DNS cache poisoning, rate limiting, DDoS attacks, all of the things that hackers are trying to do to put your authoritative domains under attack. These threat rules are maintained by our cyber threat intelligence team. So as we have new threat vectors that come out, they'll update that rule set. It's a set it and forget it kind of rule set. And we go out there and we're protecting the service of DNS for you guys. The other thing we have on the other aspect of that is we do have the ability to take that threat intelligence. So these are the, these are the reputation. We block between 4 and 10 million domains per day across this. So these are the known malware, ransomware sites. We also give you visibility into those newly created domains, all of that threat intel that we talked about. And then finally, we have a product that we call Threat Insight that actually looks at the behavior of those DNS packets, right? So not only does it have to go through, yes, it passes the intrusion prevention capability, then it passes, yes, this is not a known bad site, and now we'll actually maintain state for that DNS stream. And as we use our patented behavioral model, we can find those DNS tunnels. So even if something gets past the first 2, we have our 0-day stopper at the end. So that was a little bit about, DNS and DNS malware prevention. Infoblox, we do have a DNS for security practitioners course. And this, again, this will do a deep dive into all, it's not a product focus. It's not Infoblox product focus. It's more DNS for security practitioners. How do you want to get more information of all the different ways malware and attack vectors around DNS? And we do offer this course. So if you do want to continue your education, we do have CPE credits that will be eligible for these courses, but this is available for you guys. So with that, I thought I would transition over to a demonstration, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So first and foremost, we talked about how how DNS can be used as a threat vector. So I have a sample lab, and I've got my Linux machine pointed at my Infoblox DNS server, and it's going through my Palo Alto firewall out to the internet. And then what we did is we created in the AWS infrastructure, we created an authoritative domain that that we own, that we put our hacking tools on there. So our DNS tunneling tools will sit out here in this authoritative domain in AWS. So this is simulating exactly what malware and hackers are doing out there. And to show the other side of the coin, the unprotected side, I've configured my Firefox browser to support DNS over HTTPS or DOE, so that I can show you, and I'm pointed at Cloudflare, an unprotected DNS stream. So if I go into my infrastructure here, this is my Firefox browser, and we actually have a tool out there that we use for our DNS security assessments. We call it DEX. So what I have is the ability now in this tool. So this is just on my AWS infrastructure. I can just basically select the file here. And again, this is using Cloudflare. Let me just. There we go. Got to move the video stream. Okay, so this is just using Cloudflare unprotected DNS. And if I choose the file here, what it will do is it will take that file, chunk it up into hex code, put that into individual DNS requests, send it to the AWS infrastructure. My hacker then would take each of those requests, reassemble it, and now at the end of the day, if my DNS infrastructure allows that communication to the hacker infrastructure with no security controls, then at the hacker infrastructure, what I'll be able to do is reassemble that file, and basically I'll take the file out of the organization. So that's DNS exfiltration. It could work the other way. I could push a file down like a ransomware DNS payload to that individual workstation, just doing that same process in reverse. So in this case, if I look at it, that particular file it took 153 DNS packets, and 153 DNS packets landed on my hacker infrastructure. So that file, there was no security protection here. So now I can show you this in how we would protect against that. I'll choose, I like to use this Niagara Falls image since I'm from Buffalo. And I'll run this now in a command line. So I'm not using my browser because that's plugging towards Cloudflare. I'll use my just command line here. And it's doing the same thing. It's doing these DNS requests. But now what we're going to do is, in essence, those DNS requests are going through my Infoblox DNS server, which is also configured to say, hey, I want to make sure there's no DNS tunneling going across this infrastructure. So now it looks the same ways. The DNS requests were going off. And because we're asking for subdomains that don't exist, they're malicious domains, both when it was working and when it wasn't working, it's going to just reply back domain not found or NX domain. So your security tools may or may not catch that this is a DNS exfiltration. But now if I look back over here in my transferred files, so this is in my a peek into the AWS infrastructure, you'll notice that falls image, only 24 of those DNS packets made it to the AWS infrastructure out of the 231. So we basically said, hey, there is a DNS tunnel going on here. We're going to shut that down right away. So again, our behavior protection, it's not a one packet. It takes a few packets to catch these things because the behavior changes. We keep that score in that state and we monitor that. So that was a little bit of DNS security, and how you can use DNS as a security tool in your organization. So with that, Owen, I will open it up to questions if we have any.
Yeah, we do have one question in the chat room. This all sounds great to protect us in the office. We are still mostly out of the office. How do we protect our laptops that our employees are using at home? We primarily use Microsoft 365 and Salesforce, so they they are not connecting to the office when at home.
Yeah, perfect. So you're absolutely right. If you had a full tunnel VPN, you get this same protection. The other thing that we have from an Infoblox point of view for this particular use case is we have a shim. I call it a shim. It's a little agent that you put on your workstations, whether iPad, Android, Windows, Mac, and it basically sends the DNS packets to our cloud infrastructure so that we contain both the visibility and the security aspects of it. So because what you don't want to rely is take your laptop from home and it gets the DNS server from Starbucks or your home ISP. So if you have a security, footprint, you can put the shim on there, and now your DNS infrastructure is using us as your DNS, and all the same protection that I talked about would be in play.